Okay. You can
Good?
proceed. Yeah, it's good.
Awesome. So, to start it off at the very beginning, I'm going to be talking about bootstrapping and operating DAOs. I've worked in a dozen DAOs, primarily Metacartel and Index Coop, background in finance, and but ultimately, like, really enjoy working with people and doing more of like the DAO ops and community building side of things. The DAO I've spent the most time in and have been the most involved in has been Golbin Sax, which that started that I guess like almost 7 months ago now. Raised a couple hundred ETH to make loans, and ultimately, I think there's probably let's go like 70 or so people in the Discord. Realistically, there's probably 10 to 20 like actual like contributors in the DAO. Um, so ultimately, I think like before starting, if we're going to talk about like the bootstrapping and operating of DAOs, I think taking a step back and understanding why launching or being involved in a DAO is important is probably the first thing worth kind of addressing and answering. So really, like, it ultimately comes down to like why building a community like first is important. So, and I'll talk about kind of like product life cycles a little bit and how it's done today, how the current thinking is around it, and then we'll get more into like summoning a DAO, bootstrapping, and like some of the processes like I've gone through in launching a DAO. So why community first is important is you essentially can like build a product alongside, I would say, like the core users of that product, being the other DAO members, and it allows you to like essentially build. It allows you to essentially build kind of like as a collective, and you have just like a really good pulse of the users, which are typically yourselves in the very early stage. So before you find like product market fit, you can do that as a community. Also, like launching a DAO, whether it be a service DAO or product DAO, early stage, allows you to aggregate key resources. So I think whenever you're launching a product or offering a service, retaining the best talent. People are the talent at the end of the day. Like, people are the most important resource that you'll have. So it allows you to get a jump on resource aggregation, where typically that falls a little bit later on in the life cycle traditionally. And then also, when you build and take this DAO first approach, you're allowed to like distribute ownership to people a lot easier and more effectively. So basically, again, the people that are going to be either building a service or launching a service, building a product, are going to retain ownership of kind of the network very early on. And those are the type of people that you want to incentivize. So the way it currently works today, and I'll talk about it from the perspective of a product, basically, projects like build an MVP, take it to market, validate it. If the product is like successful, they try to build a community around it. And what I'm essentially proposing and what I think is important about launching a DAO, whether it be a service or product DAO, is essentially taking this community first experimentation approach, where you build a community first, do an experiment, and through that you can then start to identify and create a MVP if you're building a product or a service, and offer that to kind of the masses, and then launch a token to essentially decentralize like network participation after you find that. So it's just really, I think, important to understand like the why behind it and flipping the equation around to how things are traditionally done. An example of like the community first experiment, which Colton went over a little bit. So like risk DAOs, bad debt dashboard. This has been like a great way for risk DAO to get some brand recognition in early days, and ultimately, I think, win work. Like that would be a good example of a community first experiment to identify a service or a product to essentially launch. Before moving on and getting into kind of like the next section, is there any like questions? I can open it up right now just for a quick thought on questions. And if not, I'll keep going. Okay, moving on. So summoning a DAO. I'm going to be speaking really this entire part through my experience in helping launch Golbin Sax. And there's no like what I would say like right way to do things, but there are definitely a lot of like things that I would not do again. So to like get into it, I think, especially coming from a I don't really have a technical background. And so coming from this like non-technical background, ultimately my job within the DAO, specifically Golbin Sax, has been around coordination, community building, and ultimately, so like in December of 2021, a group of individuals kind of got together and were like, hey, let's make loans against NFTs. And what we did is we essentially like had this idea. We had I would say like a general sense of the market. Like if I were to do it over again, I would have spent a lot more time kind of researching the market, understanding, what other lenders were doing in the market. But ultimately, like I would say we had a general sense of what was going on. And then we kind of formulated this vision around what, Golbin Sax was. So the original vision, and Golbin Sax was originally called Gringotts DAO, and we were going to play against like the whole Harry Potter theme, but Golbin Sax just like sounded way cooler. Looking back in December 2021, the idea for Golbin Sax was like, let's make loans. And what we did is we put out an announcement. Essentially, like we started researching, compiling like what we wanted to do. We outlined a few different strategies, and basically like we formulated this vision. And through like formulating this vision, what we did is we essentially like put out an announcement of what are the like types of people that would be a good fit within the DAO, with the entire goal of maximizing. So let me actually take a step back. So our idea, like when you launch a DAO, first off, you start with an idea, you do some research around like what others are building, and you formulate a vision. And really like a vision essentially is a thesis statement. And what Golbin Sax wanted to do was we wanted to bring individuals into the community that could maximize our risk-adjusted returns. So as simple as that, like our primary goal was to bring people into Golbin Sax that could just do one thing. We were focused on maximizing returns. So the way to bring people in, I think first and foremost, you then have to identify like who are those types of people that are going to essentially like move the ball forward in maximizing, in Golbin Sax case, maximizing those risk-adjusted returns. So you have to understand like who you're targeting in this very like early stage like DAO building. So for us, it was essentially we wanted to target specifically people who understood NFTs, people with a background in finance, specifically like portfolio management. We were less concerned about, finding people that had, community building experience or marketing experience, because literally all we were doing is we were sitting on one platform and lending out money. We also wanted, at that time, people that could contribute capital. So we put out an announcement, raised a couple hundred ETH, and through that, we had what I would say like our initial base of individuals to essentially come in and be part of the DAO. So, looking up at kind of understanding your stakeholder, if we're looking at this through a service DAO perspective, your stakeholders might be fellow designers, marketers, analytics, basically people that you've worked with already. I think that's again, if I were to do Golbin Sax over again, I would have probably said, hey, do I know anyone that would be a good fit in this community, rather than putting an announcement out to the world. And I would have curated, I guess, a little bit more in the early stages. So yeah, when you're kind of going through this announcement phase, I would first and foremost kind of share the vision and really your thesis with friends first and people that you've worked with, and that you might want to work with again. If not, I think the second best way to target individuals is usually there's what I would call industry experts. For instance, one of our community members that I reached out to maybe a month or so after we officially launched the DAO was someone who had mapped the entire NFT finance ecosystem. And so I think there's ways that if I were to do things over again, in communicating my vision of the world, I would have shared it with friends first. I would have then probably reached out to individuals that I would say are domain experts and share the idea with them. You then publish the article or whatever it is with kind of your appropriate call to action. So if you're trying to target, certain individuals, you'll want to probably put a type form together or Google Forms, essentially curating your first group of contributors into the DAO. This is really just all about bringing people into the community to center around the vision. Behind the scenes, though, you're so if we think the first three bullets are essentially the DAO announcement with a call to action with essentially a form linked into the announcement. Behind the scenes, you're also going to be doing quite a bit of work. A few things that I would absolutely have lined up is making sure the first community call is planned and outlined. So essentially people are going to show up in waves. Again, it depends what you're doing and what you're building. People will show up in waves. It's important to have kind of a first community call planned out and kind of a flow of that. I would then also try to outline the first month of what your objectives are. And so going back into this example with RiskDAO, for instance, RiskDAO put their announcement out there. I don't know fully if they made the bad pet dashboard before the announcement or not. But I could see something like this being a great first monthly goal. Okay, we're gonna for instance, Golbin Sax. Our first monthly goal was to make one loan. I mean, it was as simple as that, and I think we've made over 200 now. So outlining the first month with what you want to accomplish. So essentially, people show up and they have an idea of what they want to do. And then one like other piece of advice I would give in this like early stage community building is don't over engineer and overthink things. Really, like the most important thing to get right in bringing people together is communicating like this vision. And like I've said it, there's probably like you could probably control F and try to type the word communicate in this deck, and I'd probably say it like 20 times. But your job in general when launching a community is communicating the overall idea of what you're doing and continuing to do that. Like at Golbin Sax, we're 7 months in. We've raised a operational round of 1.5 million. We've raised a couple hundred ETH to make loans, and we still don't even like have a governance process like fully flushed out and set up. Like we literally just do Discord like soft polling. This should say Discord. Yeah. So again, I think there's a tendency for individuals when starting things to overcomplicate. And really what it comes down to is you have a vision, you spread the word to a few people, and behind the scenes you put some loose structure together. And going into kind of like my next slide, so again, I think the most important thing when launching a DAO, whether it be a product or service, is to start small. You want to start very small, highly curated, and you want to move fast. So you put your announcement out to the world, people are going to start showing up in Discord, or they're going to fill out, a type form that says like, hey, I want to join this DAO. I vibe with what you guys are doing. The most important thing after this is something I would have done much differently at Golbin Sax. So we originally onboarded like 30 people. I would have onboarded probably five to 10. And I would have, my main priority at that time was let me try to get more capital into the DAO. And honestly, like we had a goal, which was fine. We achieved that goal, but realistically, we could have done it with a lot less. So yeah, basically people are going to start showing up, and your goal, once people show up, is to curate. You want to be like, you want to bring in people that are highly aligned with your vision. And part of your job when curating is to constantly communicate your vision to the people that you're speaking with. So you're going to speak to a lot of people in early days. And some of the mistakes I made is, someone wouldn't fully understand what we were trying to do at Golbin Sax. Someone would have an idea of like, hey, have you ever thought of this? And I would spend too much time kind of chasing those rabbits down different, like I would waste time essentially, and it would create a lot of stress for me in this early day. So I think once your vision is set, it's very important to just kind of stick to it. You should listen to what others are essentially saying, but take everything with a grain of salt. I would say 95% of what I heard looking back on it was just a complete waste of time. Someone asked me, it was maybe like a week or so ago, about, what is like one of the, I guess, misconceptions about DAOs that, people might have. And I think what I would like respond to that now is I put a lot of priority on, we want to decentralize fast and we want to be decentralized from day one. That was like my thinking, I would say, even like 6 months ago, 6 months ago, that was more of my thinking about when launching a DAO, like be fully decentralized. But what comes from that is a sacrifice of being able to move fast. And I think it's actually, I'm coming more to this thought process of it's actually very important to stay what I would say like centralized early on, So Golbin Sax, we brought in 30 people. Again, I would have said like 5 to 10. And then slowly, I think, decentralizing as you start finding your product market fit. So whether that's you're building a product or offering a service. And right now, with Golbin Sax, like, we've been doing this for 7 months. We've raised some capital, and I would still stay like more centralized than not. Like, we're at the point where we're going to be giving and giving more autonomy to like leaders to like manage certain verticals and work streams within the DAO. So yeah, like, don't worry about like decentralizing from day one. Kind of talking about like the first experiment, which we talked a little bit about before. So like, you're going to bring, individuals in, and I just took a step back. So you're going to bring people into the community. One of the traps, I would say, early on is wasting time, right? So it's like listening to essentially everyone's perspective and chasing it down and trying to build something around it. So this applies to the initial contributors within your community. So essentially, when you're communicating the first experiment, and when you're communicating to this very core first group of DAO contributors, you're going to want to, again, I think on the community call, kind of like the first community call, very much like set the direction. So this is when you communicate the first experiment, the first goal. So for like risk DAO, it might have been something like this. Let's build a bad debt dashboard. Something specific, start very small. So you communicate that kind of on the first community call. You delegate kind of, I think, the responsibility. Since it's going to be a small group of people in your DAO, I think it's important to, again, find complementary individuals. So when you do like make that announcement and you start going through like resumes or whatever it is, like Twitters or, when you start talking to these individuals, think about what's a good complement to achieve your vision. And then ultimately, like when you're communicating the first experiment, you'll want to delegate some of the tasks to individuals. So moving on a little bit into delegation. The most challenging thing that I've found in working in DAOs, it's not necessarily like what you're building. It's actually the people that you're working with and relying upon to essentially get something done. So the way I think about it in the mental model that I ascribe to is, as a DAO like coordinator or operator, you should really spend time with people that aren't going to like essentially just steal a bunch of time from you. And so I like mentally, when I speak with people and when I give individuals tasks, I mentally break out, I want to spend time with A and B players, essentially only. So my definition of like what an A player is, I could give someone a task, like let's say we want to build out a dashboard. I can give, a front-end developer a task of, hey, we want to build this dashboard with minimal guidance, and they could come back to me with a prototype that essentially is like ready to ship with minimal input. These people in DAOs are going to be a dime a dozen. They're going to be very difficult to find. Typically, the type of people that I've found in working with DAOs fall in this camp. And it's not because they're not talented, but usually it's because the barrier of entry to joining and working in DAO is a little bit lower. So these individuals tend to be a little bit less experienced, or they don't have as much capital, which is totally fine. So definition of like a B player is someone that can like execute, or requires like probably an hour or two of iterations. And what I mean by that is If I'm like, hey, XYZ person, we're trying to build a dashboard, typically they'll come back, instead of a final product, they'll come back with, a scope of what we're like. They'll come back and it will require like 2 hours of meetings. This is fine and it's usually tolerable in small communities. And mind you, anyone can kind of like shift. So like this is like an ever ongoing kind of like evaluation that I do in my head. A players can become B players, B players can become A players, and vice versa. These are the type of individuals you want to be mindful of if they are in a community with you. And these are the people that essentially are there, and it's like a very like challenging thing to realize, and especially it's very nuanced to kind of like bucket these type of people in your head, right? Because a lot of the times when you join a community, like there's this education gap where you do need to spend time with everyone, making sure they're up to speed. And you actually typically don't have to do that with A players, but like with B and C players, you do have to take the time to make sure the vision is like, very clear in their head before they start working. There will be, though, for instance, I spend time with doing one-on-ones with community members every week. And these are the type of people that just add stress to your life and they make things more difficult. Sometimes they even execute, but at the end of the day, they really just steal time from you. So in a, ideal scenario, anyone who's a C player in the community, you really don't want to spend a ton of time focused on them. And I think the hard part about working in a DAO and being kind of a DAO like operator is, look, I'm generally like, I like people, and it's very hard for me to say like, okay, I can't spend time with you. It's very difficult for me. So I think that's like a high EQ thing, though, that any DAO operator will have to go through at some point. Okay, so. And I know we've been jumping around a little bit. So we have an idea. We've communicated the idea, we have a vision or a thesis. We've communicated that. We've brought people in, and they're starting to work on the first experiment. Talk quickly about incentivizing people. So now you want to think about like how do we reward individuals within the community. And to keep it as simple as possible, because I know we're running short on time, and I want to leave some time open for Q&A, I typically just use coordinate. So keep it simple. All you have to do is set up a multi-sig. Any funds that you receive can go in the multi-sig. And if the community's small, just set up a coordinate PPOC and retroactively compensate individuals that way. I do have a slide in here about raising capital. I don't think it's probably, this is kind of like at the end of what I would call like phase one of community building. This is essentially when you run your first experiment, you do something, and it starts working. It's kind of like this interesting dynamic of like, should I go out and raise capital or should I not? I'm going to just leave this in here. Anyone can poke around, but I'm not going to talk a ton about raising capital right now. I think there's better use of time. Challenges you'll face when launching a community or being an operator and on. So essentially, like when you think about, again, I think working with people are the challenge. So the broader the scope of what you're doing is, the more challenging it will be. The more people that you're coordinating, the more challenging it will be. So basically, when you add complexity to the vision or to your thesis, it will be a lot harder. And ultimately, you have less time to focus on shipping. More challenges, people are tough. DAOs move too slow in general. So like one thing that I've learned a ton over the last 7 months is you need to execute and ship fast, whether it be a service or a product. And then finally, complexity adds, it just makes things just terrible working in DAOs, to tell you the truth. So keep everything very simple. To close it out, so there will be a lot of failure when you're in an early stage, like community building scenario. And basically, here are some things that I think are like the most important things that you can do as a DAO operator. And these, like, for me, these are things that I don't sacrifice. So I try to show up the same way day in and day out to the community. So when you're a coordinator, your job is to essentially just like be the steady kind of like person in the DAO. And ultimately people will just like, you're going to be setting the tempo essentially. So a few things I never do is like, I never skip a weekly community call. So regardless of if there's anything to even talk about, I try to throw at least a few slides together, and it's just it's a time for us all to kind of like be on the same page. I'm very like principled with how I operate, and I think this helps. Basically, I don't pretend to kind of like know everything. I admit when I'm wrong, and I admit when I don't know something. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to kind of really just like speak with conviction, because you're going to be the individual, I guess, like steering the ship very early on. So you might not always be right, but it's important to just keep moving in one direction. Lead by example. I try to like honestly deliver product more than anyone else. I really set the tempo. Be vulnerable. I ask for help. Like, it's not very natural for me, but I think asking for help and being vulnerable in front of the community is great. And then finally, and this is probably the most important and something that I'm terrible at, is understanding when to take a step back. And so, if my goal is never to skip a community call, and I need to take a step back, it's as simple as like, hey, I'm going to take the week off today, like this week. I really need it, and I give that responsibility of the community call to someone else. But yeah, rest is extremely important, especially when your goal of an early stage like DAO operator is to essentially showing up in the same way every day. You will burn out. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I know we have like 3 minutes for questions, so I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Yeah, there's one that Nate typed out. He says, you say that it would be better to invest more time in the summoning stage. What was the impact of rushing this phase?
Like why did I feel like I rushed?
Yeah. Maybe I will jump in. Hi. I was trying to ask you for maybe an example, real-life example of the consequences of rushing that part of the summoning adapt.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when you're not clear on the like vision or the direction that you're going, it's going to be impossible to get people aligned with you. And I mean, like, to me, that's the most important part is you really have to communicate like what you're doing extremely well. And I would say like with Golbin Sax, we had this original idea of like, hey, let's just make a loan. And if I were to do it again, I would have been much more concise on how we would have done that. And I would have been more concise about planning my first month. Again, like, people don't show up because they're like, yeah, you're going to have some people that say like one token, right, when they show up. And ultimately you just ignore those people. But people don't show up, and because of like generally what I found is people show up to work within a group of people that are very aligned, either from a personal standpoint or they're very aligned on what is being built. So I think, again, that's the most important part to get right. Because if you know where you're going, it makes just everything so much easier. And yeah, you're going to get a lot of questions early days of like, why aren't you doing it this way? Why aren't you doing it this way? Whatever it is, right? And you can always fall back on saying, and just kind of like repeating that vision. So yeah, I don't know if that was a good answer, but I do think it's the most important part.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and honestly, like if anyone wants to talk to me about like early stage kind of community building, DAO building, yeah, feel free to like just DM me. That's not an issue. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you, Hamas, for this session. It was quite informative. If we do not...
For sure. Yeah. Again, anyone feel free to reach out. And thanks.
Thank you, Hamas. Okay, let me stop the recording. Danny, did you want to say something?
Oh, sorry.